On Thanksgiving morning in 1900, an 18-year-old named Thomas Pedler told his mother that he was going out for a bit, but he'd be back in time for turkey that afternoon, and then he grabbed his jacket and his coat and he headed out the door. Thomas lived in a very working-class neighborhood in San Francisco, California, where, generally speaking, nothing big really ever happened. It was kind of a place where people just worked, and that was it. But on this day, something huge was happening in Thomas's neighborhood. The big football game between Stanford University and the University of California was taking place at the stadium in Thomas's district, and they were expecting over 20,000 people to cram into this stadium. And so Thomas was not about to miss this incredible spectacle, even though he didn't have enough money to buy a ticket. But he knew he would find a way to watch this game. And so Thomas leaves his house and he runs to the stadium, which was not far from his house, and he waited in front of the front gate where all these people are streaming in to go into the stadium. And around 11 a.m., Thomas's very close friend, Charles, who was also a young man, made his way to the front gate. The two met up, and at first, their plan was to try to sneak in with the horde of people that were making their way into the stadium. But even though they were still hours away from the opening kickoff of this big game, it was at 2:30 p.m., the stadium was packed. I mean, there was nowhere to sit, there was nowhere to stand. People that had tickets who were going in are looking around thinking, where are we going to watch this game? And so Thomas and Charles are kind of like, well, what's the point of sneaking in if there's nowhere to watch? And so they decided, okay, we need to find another way to watch this game. And so they began looking around and they noticed there was a huge fence that lined the perimeter of this stadium. And they saw there was some people kind of climbed up on this fence trying to get a view down onto the field. And pretty quickly, when Thomas and Charles decided they would try to do that too, they saw that all the good spots on this fence were already taken. The spots that were open provided no view onto the field. And so that option as well didn't work. And so Thomas and Charles are frustrated. They're starting to worry that they will not see this big game. But when they walked back over to the front gates of the stadium, they happened to notice across the street was this group of people rushing over to this big white brick factory building. And they were literally placing ladders up against the sides of this building and beginning to climb up it. I mean, this is a 5-story building and they are just basically free climbing the windows and the fire escape. And Thomas and Charles realized that the top of this factory was flat and provided a perfect view down onto the field. And so all these people, they're trying to get a good seat to watch this game. And so without any hesitation, Thomas and Charles decide they're going to do that too. So they left the stadium, they ran across the street, and they began climbing up the ladders and climbing the windows and the fire escapes until finally they made it onto the roof, 55 feet off the ground. And when they got up there, there wasn't that many people. And so Thomas and Charles were able to run right over to the front edge of this building and claim a spot with an absolutely perfect view of the game. A couple of hours later, at 2:30 p.m., when the game actually started, the rooftop that Thomas and Charles were on was now completely packed with people. Hundreds of people have climbed up onto this factory. There were some factory workers down below telling people, do not do this. Do not climb on top of this factory. It's not safe. But nobody listened to them, and the police either didn't notice this was happening or they didn't care. And so there's all these people that are on this roof. They're all super excited, and the game has begun. It's 2:30, and as soon as the game started, it was like the crowd in the stadium, which could be heard very easily from this rooftop, just kind of erupted, and there were all these bands playing in the stadium. I mean, it was chaos down below, and it really caught on the roof. All these guys, including Thomas and Charles, they're getting amped about this game. They're singing, they're chanting, they're screaming, they're yelling. I mean, it's total chaos. And Thomas and Charles loved it. But about 20 minutes into the game, as Thomas and Charles are enjoying themselves and the crowd is still going wild, a dull cracking sound could be heard coming from one side of this roof. And so Thomas and Charles, they kind of spun around to see where this cracking sound had come from. And when they began looking out across the sea of people, they noticed on the far side of the roof where the sound had kind of come from, they could see people scrambling to get off the roof. But before Thomas and Charles and the other people around them who were watching this happening could figure out what was going on, there was a much louder cracking sound, and suddenly the floor underneath Thomas, Charles, and everybody else collapsed. And immediately, people on this roof fell all the way to the bottom of this factory, 55 feet below. There weren't loads of floors inside of this factory. Instead, it was basically just one big building, 55 feet high, that housed this brick structure right in the center of the factory that was almost as tall as the entire factory. It was almost like the factory was a shell around this brick smaller structure right in the middle that was like 40 feet tall. And so after the ceiling collapses, Thomas, he falls, but miraculously, he lands on a wooden beam that stretched across the entire factory, like a support beam, and he grabbed onto it, saving himself from falling all the way down. And so Thomas, he only fell maybe 5 feet, so he was okay, but he didn't have a great grip on this beam. He was holding on, but just barely. And so Thomas, he turns and he's looking around at what's happened below him, and he's hearing people screaming, and he's hearing the sounds of people running around trying to help those who have hit the ground on the bottom. And Thomas immediately begins scanning for Charles, and he finds him. Charles was one of the other fairly lucky people, at least in Thomas's mind, Charles seemed lucky, because instead of falling from the roof all the way to the ground, Charles and 15 or 20 other people had fallen right onto that brick structure that kind of made up the main part of this factory. And so Charles had only fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet onto this structure. And so Thomas is thinking, oh, Charles and these other people, they've survived this fall. They're okay. However, the second Charles and the others, who supposedly were saved by landing on this brick structure, the second they hit that brick structure, despite not suffering catastrophic injuries like broken bones and horrible internal injuries, these people on the brick structure began letting out these primal screams, these just horrible, blood-curdling screams. And as they did, these loud popping sounds began coming out of their body, and then their bodies began contorting forward, almost like a bug rolling up onto itself. It would turn out this factory was not a normal factory. This was a glass factory, and in order to make glass, you need to heat sand and some other chemicals up to extraordinarily high temperatures. You need a furnace that can literally burn hotter than lava. And so that brick structure that was housed in the middle of this 5-story tall factory was a glass furnace, and it was on. And so even though the inside of this furnace was the hottest place, it was over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the outside of this furnace, where Charles and the others had landed, believing they were saved from this 55-foot fall to their death, was still extremely hot. So hot that the factory workers couldn't even go near the furnace, even with special equipment on. The way they worked with this furnace was with these long metal pokers. They would work the flames and the glass at a distance. And so the instant that Charles and the others landed on the top of this furnace, they began to light on fire. Those snapping sounds that were coming out of their bodies was the sound of them instantly igniting on fire. And so Thomas and the others who had initially survived this horrible collapse watched as Charles and the others shrieked, and their bodies continued to contort, and they continued to burn and smolder. And Charles actually, he would roll up so tightly that his body began to roll down the curved side of this furnace, and at some point his body slipped into a crack in the furnace, and he actually fell into the flames inside, at which point he went silent. Around the time that Charles and the others stopped shrieking, a number of people just out on the road heard the commotion, and they came inside, and one of them was Thomas's father. And in a terrible twist of fate, he actually looked up and saw his son clinging to the beam, Thomas, except it was so hot inside of this factory that Thomas was sweating, he was losing his grip, it was really hard to hold on to this beam, and his father watched as Thomas lost his grip and fell the 10 more feet down onto the furnace exterior. He landed feet first, then he fell onto his stomach and his face. He immediately ignited on fire, began shrieking, and then went silent. All told, 23 people would be killed during during this roof collapse, and dozens more would be horribly injured and disfigured. This collapse goes down as one of the very worst disasters in sports history. However, on this day, the crowd inside the stadium was so caught up in the game that they actually didn't notice this horrible tragedy taking place just 100 feet away from where they were. It wasn't until the end of the game, when the winning team's fans carried their players in this kind of spontaneous parade out of the stadium to celebrate, that they walked out onto the street and saw all these burnt up, rolled up corpses of the people who had landed on the furnace. At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And any time she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs. They had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging, even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone, and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers. And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her. She has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull, and he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes, and then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man, who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance, Sumitra had predicted she would die. On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine, and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her, and as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances. And so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this. But then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored. And so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped, and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked. And then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside, and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra, and began checking her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important for both religious and public health reasons to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances. They happened all the time for months. But what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, normally kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside, it's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked, even though for the past 45 minutes she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse. He looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup. He saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family, this is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku, but when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school, and so did not know how to write. But now, suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard, looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here, I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear, and Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong, but Sumitra's husband couldn't couldn't tell what Sumitra had said, and so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband, and apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face, and she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond, and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over, and Sumitra followed him, they sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry, and then she looked at Ram Tripathi, and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home, 60 miles away, was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares, screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, "Oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital." Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station location, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes, he brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him, and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second. What Sumitra was saying was, Papa. In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Duety. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. On February 15th, 2004, two police officers drove down a quiet street in a little English village called Mrballen, and they pulled over in front of this little brick bungalow. Earlier that day, a neighbor who lived on the street had called the police to report hearing a strange digging sound coming from inside of this bungalow. And so these officers had been sent out to see what the sound was and make sure the occupants of this home were okay. Now, these two officers were not particularly worried about the occupants of this house. They assumed that some wild animal must have snuck in while the owners were away, and that was all this was. But, as they would quickly learn, that was not the case. After climbing out of their car, the two officers just stopped and listened for a second to see if they could hear this digging sound, but the bungalow was quiet, the street was quiet, and so the two officers shut their car doors and made their way up to the front porch of this bungalow and knocked on the front door. After a few moments, when nobody answered, one of the officers reached down and tried the handle and found it was unlocked. And so he opened the door just a crack and he called out through this opening in the door into the bungalow saying, "Hey, it's police, we're here to check on you." But when no one called back to them, the officer opened the door the rest of the way, and immediately both officers saw there was a huge problem inside of this house. The entire first floor was flooded with several inches of water, and they could hear from somewhere in the back of the property the sound of running water. And so again, both officers called out into this house to try to get the attention of anyone who might be inside. And when again they were met with silence, the officers walked into the flooded house and began walking straight back towards this running water sound. And eventually, after walking through the living room, they entered this hallway that went right to the back of the property. And as soon as they were in it, they could see there was an open door at the end of the hallway on the left. And it seemed like the running water sound was coming out of that room. And so the two officers, one by one, sloshed down this hallway to this room. They turned left, looked inside, and what they saw completely shocked them and immediately sprung them into action. 2 months before these officers came to this bungalow and found it flooded with water, the owner of this bungalow, 51-year-old Ronald McClagish, had broken up with his girlfriend. And this breakup was really hard on Ronald. He was already divorced. He was totally broke. He had loads of health issues like bad asthma. He had some liver issues. And just generally, he was someone who was kind of physically frail. And so this girlfriend had been one of the very few good things in his life. And now she was gone and he was alone again. And so very quickly after this breakup, Ronald fell into a very dark depression. And so for 6 weeks after they broke up, Ronald, for the most part, just stayed in bed and kind of moped around his bungalow, kind of feeling bad for himself. But then finally, at the end of those first 6 weeks after the breakup, Ronald decided he wanted to get his life back together and just move on. So on February 1st, 2004, so roughly 2 weeks before those two officers would come to his bungalow because of this digging sound, Ronald would wake up feeling determined to start anew. And the first thing he was going to do was purge his bungalow of anything that was his ex-girlfriend's. She left a lot of things behind when they broke up. She had not collected them. And so now they were just kind of sources of pain. And where most of her stuff was inside of Ronald's bungalow was in this closet in one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. So that morning, Ronald headed down the hall. He turned left into the bedroom. He opened up the closet. He went inside, and with a trash bag in hand, he began rifling through everything in this closet, and anything that was hers, he would take it and put it right into the trash bag. And at some point, when Ronald was almost done pulling the last few things of his girlfriend's out and into the trash bag, from behind him, he heard this strange sound coming from the bedroom. It sounded like wood bending or creaking, but before he could turn around to see what the sound was, the door to the closet he was in slammed shut with incredible force, and suddenly Ronald was trapped inside of this closet in total darkness. Now, Ronald was likely shocked at first, but he would have reached and tried for the handle and found that no matter what he did, he could not open this closet again. And so Ronald began screaming for help and pounding on the door, but nobody came to help him. The closet that Ronald was in was fairly tall, but it was only 2 feet wide by about 2 feet deep, which meant Ronald could only stand inside of this closet. He couldn't sit down, he couldn't bend down, he literally was trapped standing. And Ronald didn't have water, he didn't have food, he knew that no one was going to be checking on him anytime soon, and even though his bungalow was kind of small and shabby, it was built out of brick. And so the likelihood that his calls for help were penetrating outside loud enough that people could hear them and that they would come in and rescue him was pretty slim. And so at some point that evening, Ronald realized he needed to do something different if he was going to get out of this closet. And so above him were a series of pipes across the ceiling. And so he reached up and he grabbed one of them and he broke it off. He was likely thinking that with this pipe, maybe he can burrow a hole in the wall and crawl through to another room, or maybe he can punch a hole in the door and somehow unlock it, or at a minimum, with the metal pipe, smashing it against the wall or the door would be louder than any noise he could make by yelling. However, the second he broke that pipe off the ceiling, something horrible happened. The pipe he broke was a water pipe. And as soon as it was broken, icy cold water began pouring down directly on top of Ronald's head and face. And again, because he can only stand basically in the middle of this closet, he couldn't get out of the way of this water. It was like he was under a waterfall and couldn't go anywhere. And so he likely tried to ignore the water and tried to use the pipe and screamed and do anything he could to get someone to know he was in here, but no one could hear him. And so it was like he was being tortured with this freezing water, and he's in this tight claustrophobic space. It's total darkness and he's totally panicking. And for days and days, that would be Ronald's nightmarish reality. But despite how terrible his circumstances were, Ronald continued to use that pipe to both smash the walls to make loud sounds. He also began burrowing into the walls, trying to make a hole. But Ronald was getting weaker and weaker. He became very sick. And also, because the water was constantly hitting his head and face, his skin got so saturated that literally his skin started falling off. It basically opened up into these sores and began to sag, and the water just began brushing his skin off. And so finally, after about a week of being trapped in this closet in these terrible conditions, Ronald realized help was not going to come in time, and so he put his pipe down, he kind of slumped up against the wall, and then closed his eyes. Ronald's neighbor, who called the police, actually did hear Ronald using that pipe to try to dig a hole in his wall, and she heard Ronald smashing the pipe on his door, and she must have heard muffled shrieks and yells, but she didn't know what they were and kind of just decided it wasn't her business. But when Ronald's house went from all these strange sounds to silence, that was when she called the police and said, "Hey, I had heard some digging sounds coming from the bungalow, and now I don't." And so when those two police officers arrived at Ronald's bungalow, they went inside, they went down the hallway, they went into the bedroom where Ronald had gone, and they saw this huge wardrobe, which is a big wooden piece of furniture, toppled over right in front of the closet. And at the bottom of the closet, they saw 2 human feet protruding from underneath that little space at the bottom of the closet. Those feet belonged to Ronald. He had managed to force his feet underneath the closet, but of course, he could not have fit underneath the closet door. And so the 2 police officers rushed over, and together, they barely were able to get this wardrobe off of the closet door. And when they opened the door up, Ronald was in there. He was deceased. His body was still in a standing position, kind of rigid and propped up against the wall, and freezing water was still pouring down onto his head. It would turn out no one had intentionally trapped Ronald. Instead, his wardrobe was just unstable, and it happened to topple over at the worst possible moment. On June 29th, 2013, 35-year-old Larry Wells woke up at 3 a.m., slipping out of his bed quietly so he wouldn't wake up his wife. Larry's wife was 3 months pregnant, and raising their 4-year-old daughter was already a full-time job for her, so Larry wanted to be sure that she got all the sleep she needed. After climbing out of bed, Larry slipped into his work clothes that he had laid out the night before, and then he tiptoed through the house out to his car. Larry drove for about 5 minutes through the desolate streets of Hamburg, which is a quiet suburb just outside of Buffalo, New York. And at this hour, pretty much every business in town was closed, so it was very quiet and peaceful. Larry eventually turned into a large parking lot and pulled into a parking space. He got out of his car and began walking toward the big, sprawling building at the center of the lot. And as he walked towards it, he glanced up at the sign above the entrance of the building, and as he looked, he smiled. This sign represented something that had deep roots in Larry's childhood and also now an important place in Larry's adult life. That sign's multicolored letters spelled out Toys R Us. Toys R Us was a very popular toy store chain in the United States at the time, and it's where Larry had worked for the last 7 years. Larry loved kids, and for a while he had wanted to become a teacher. He had actually studied education and even got a master's degree, but after graduate school, he couldn't find a full-time teaching job, so he wound up working as a substitute teacher. But at the time, Larry and his wife wanted to start a family and move into a new house, so that's when Larry decided to get a job working at Toys R Us to supplement his income. At first, Larry thought of his job at Toys R Us as just being a sort of placeholder job, something to have until he got hired on as a full-time teacher somewhere. But it turned out Larry sort of loved working there. He got to regularly interact with children, which he loved doing, and also his fun-loving personality and solid work ethic just made him a perfect fit for the company. And so pretty quickly, Larry took a lot of pride in his job at Toys R Us. And all of his coworkers there adored him, and by the time he and his wife had their first child in 2009, Larry had been promoted to store manager. This was his career. And because Larry cared so much about this job and about Toys R Us, he would often start work at 4 a.m. on Saturday mornings just to help the stockers unload the merchandise trucks, even though he didn't have to do that. And that's exactly what he was doing on this particular Saturday morning, showing up early to lend a helping hand. And so Larry walked up to the front door of the Toys R Us building, and waiting outside were two of his employees, Cindy Barone and Isaac Millette Lloyd. The building was locked, so Larry pulled out his keys, unlocked the door, slid it open, and let the two workers inside. Larry walked in after them, and then slid the door shut and locked it back up, because the store wasn't actually scheduled to open for another several hours. Cindy and Isaac made their way over to the time clock and punched in, then they picked up their walkie-talkies, which they clipped to their belts, and they began their shifts. As for Larry, he headed straight to the storeroom, opened up the back door for the merchandise truck driver, and then began helping the driver unload the truck. And then at some point, Cindy and Isaac came over, and they grabbed pallets of this merchandise from the back, and then wheeled those pallets into the store on dollies. Isaac took his pallet to his section of the store, while Cindy took her merchandise pallet to the next section over. And then both of them got to work restocking the shelves, which had been thinned out by the Friday night rush. By 4:30 a.m., the truck was fully unloaded, so Larry let the driver back out of the building and then locked the back door after him. At this point, Larry, Cindy, and Isaac were now working in separate parts of the building, and they couldn't see each other, but they could communicate using their walkie-talkie radios. And you need to keep in mind that this particular Toys R Us store was massive, over 41,000 square feet. And so really it was normal if you were working in off-hour shifts to basically not see anybody else physically and just basically talk to them on your walkie-talkie. A little before 5 a.m., so about 30 minutes later, an employee named Anthony Armstrong stood outside the front entrance, pulled out his cell phone, and called his manager, Larry, and told him he was outside the store, ready to start his shift, and could he come over and unlock the door. And so Larry made his way to the front door, he opened it up, let Anthony inside, and then slid the door shut and locked it back up. About 10 minutes after that, another employee named Richard Shepard approached the front door of the Toys R Us and also called Larry so he could be let in the building. But this time, Larry's phone just rang several times and went to voicemail. So Richard sent Larry a text message and then waited a minute for a reply, hoping he would reply soon, but he didn't. And so as Richard is just sort of standing there, he pressed his face against the glass and peered into the store to look for any movement, thinking maybe he could, bang on the door and get one of the other employees' attention so they could let him in. But he didn't see anybody. So feeling sort of frustrated, Richard stepped away from the door and walked east towards the Babies R Us side of the building, which had a separate entrance from the main store. And when he got there, he found one of the sliding doors at Babies R Us was wide open. Now, this really surprised Richard because the company had very strict loss prevention policies that required all doors to remain locked during non-business hours. But this was actually kind of lucky for him because now he was able to just stroll right into the store without needing anyone to help him inside. And so once he was in, Richard clocked in and began his shift stocking shelves in his section. Now, at this point, Richard still hadn't seen anybody else. And he did think it was kind of eerie to be all alone in this vast fluorescent-lit store before the sun had even come up. A few sections over from Richard, Isaac was still stocking his shelves, and he was taking his time as usual because Isaac was meticulous and took great pride in his work. He also really liked Larry as a manager, and so he always tried to do a really good job when Larry was around because he wanted to impress Larry. Cindy, on the other hand, was actually almost done stocking her section. But it wasn't because she was lazy, it was because she had worked at Toys R Us longer than a lot of the other employees, and so she knew the merchandise inside and out, and she could basically make her way through the entire giant store with her eyes closed, and so she was just really quick. As the hour wore on, all the employees kept plugging away, sort of independent of each other, and outside, as the sky turned from pitch black to a pale blue as the sun rose, the lights in the parking lot switched off for the day. Isaac looked outside and noticed the sun coming up, and he knew the store was going to be opening in just a couple of hours, and he still had more merchandise that he would need to put out onto the shelves. So he wheeled his now empty pallet to the back of the store into the stock room, and he was about to load up another full pallet of merchandise when he suddenly heard a noise coming from inside the store. It was a repetitive noise, like a wailing sound, but sort of flat and robotic. At first, just because Isaac didn't know what the sound was, he simply tried to ignore it and just focus on his work. But the sound just kept going on, and nobody seemed to be turning it off, and that's when Isaac realized this was actually an alarm going off inside the store. And so Isaac stopped what he was doing, and he pulled out his radio, and he pressed the button and said, "Hey Larry, there's an alarm going off in the store, can you please turn it off?" But a minute went by, and the alarm still kept going, and there were no responses from Larry on the radio. And so Isaac turned the channel on his radio and radioed everyone in the store and asked for someone to please go find Larry and please get him to turn off that alarm. Cindy happened to be closest to the manager's office at the front of the store when Isaac made this radio call, and so Cindy replied into the radio that she would go see if Larry was in his office. Shortly after that, Isaac emerged from the stockroom, pulling behind him a pallet of merchandise, and as he did, suddenly a woman's scream echoed through the entire store, and then Isaac heard this woman sobbing and shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Isaac had never heard Cindy scream or cry before, so at first, he wasn't even sure if it was her. He just felt completely disoriented. And then Isaac saw his coworker Anthony rushing towards the manager's office, and so Isaac followed behind. Outside the office, both men saw Cindy crying and shaking, and in between sobs, she said she needed to call 911, and then she rushed past them, picked up a phone from one of the checkout lanes, and dialed. At this point, Richard, the employee who had shown up last, rushed up the aisle to where Isaac and Anthony were now standing, and the three men just sort of looked at each other, confused and frightened, and then, without a better plan, they just walked into the manager's office, and immediately it became clear why Cindy was so upset. Their manager, Larry, was slumped over in his chair, bleeding profusely from a hole in his chest. Isaac reflexively called out to Larry, but Larry didn't respond. The only sound in the office was a loud pulsing screech from the phone receiver, which had been left off the hook. And so the three men just turned and ran out of the office over to Cindy, who by this point was on the phone with 911, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that their manager had been shot and she wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The Hamburg Police Department received word from dispatch of a shooting with a possible active shooter scenario at the Toys R Us, and so every police unit in town busted a U-turn and sped in their cruisers straight for the store. Now, the 911 operator had told Cindy that the police were going to be there soon, and so everybody in the store needed to exit immediately and wait in the parking lot. So minutes later, the police arrived at the store, they saw the four employees outside waiting for them, and so after moving the employees across the street to a safe location, the police went inside the store ready to potentially engage with an active shooter, because nobody knew for sure what the situation really was. Was there still an armed shooter inside somewhere? Or maybe had they left the store and they were on the loose in the area? Nobody knew. Detective Sergeant Scott Cascino was still at home and barely awake when he got the call about the shooting, and he found himself feeling totally confused and wondering if he had even heard correctly. Like, the idea that there was a shooting inside of a Toys R Us at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Hamburg, of all places, just seemed impossible. Cascino was a veteran detective who knew that the town of Hamburg had very little violent crime. So as he quickly got dressed and hopped into his police-issued vehicle and drove to the Toys R Us, he really didn't know what to expect. When Cascino arrived at Toys R Us and parked his car in the lot, he watched as the other police officers who had already arrived began carefully advancing towards the building with their guns drawn. Those officers would slowly make their way through the store looking for anybody, but finding no one, before finally getting to the manager's office, where they went inside and they saw what Cindy had seen. Larry, all alone inside, slumped over in his chair. The police called out Larry's name several times, but he was unresponsive. One of the officers walked over to him and pressed his fingers into Larry's wrist, and he turned to his colleagues and signaled that Larry did still have a pulse. But the officers saw all the blood on the floor and they could barely hear Larry's breathing, and so they agreed they basically had no time to waste here in getting this man medical attention. And so the officers just grabbed Larry by the shoulders and dragged him out of his office, through the store and out the front door, right to a waiting ambulance. 2 EMTs lifted Larry onto a gurney, they strapped him down and then placed him into the back of the ambulance, and then the EMTs hopped in with him, closed the doors, and the ambulance sped off towards the hospital. And as that ambulance sped across town, the EMTs in the back worked on Larry, trying to compress the wound in his chest and get the bleeding to stop. The EMTs noticed that in addition to the huge hole in Larry's chest, there was another wound in his shoulder, but comparatively speaking, it was not nearly as big of a deal as the chest wound. And then as the EMTs continued doing their work, they realized, these wounds were not gunshot wounds, they were knife wounds. Larry had been stabbed. However, despite all the efforts made by these EMTs to try to save Larry, he would unfortunately pass away from his wounds when they were only about halfway to the hospital. Back at the Toys R Us, police had set up a perimeter around the property, and then the SWAT team arrived. The SWAT team then searched both inside and outside the building, and then reported to Detective Cascino that they didn't find anything or anyone that was suspicious, and so at this point, all investigators were clear to now enter the building. It was also around this time that Detective Cascino and the rest of the first responders learned that the victim had died on the way to the hospital, and that contrary to what the initial theory had been, that he had not been shot, he had been stabbed to death. Cascino and crime scene investigators proceeded into the Toys R Us and headed directly into the manager's office, where Larry had been found. Once inside, everything was carefully swabbed for DNA and dusted for fingerprints, and as they did this, investigators were careful not to step in the long streak of Larry's blood that had been left there on the ground when the police had dragged him out. There was also a security DVR on the table. It was where footage from all the store's security cameras was fed and recorded onto a hard drive. And very clearly, the power cord to that security DVR had been unplugged and pulled away from the wall. Cascino had a hunch that one of the employees who had been working that morning was Larry's killer, and the footage from the surveillance cameras around the property may very well reveal which one it was. So getting this DVR connected and reviewing the footage on it from the surveillance cameras would be crucial. At this point, the 4 employees who had been there that morning, Cindy, Isaac, Anthony, and Richard, were the primary suspects in this murder. And so Cascino and his team quickly separated them so they could all be interviewed individually. Investigators put Isaac in the passenger seat of one of the police cruisers, and Cascino sat in the car with him. And the first thing Cascino noticed was how Isaac was trembling and tripping over his words. And so Isaac's nervousness and his inability to answer questions clearly made him seem suspicious, and so did the behavior of Anthony Armstrong, who was the youngest member of the employee crew. He completely clammed up during his interview and refused to answer questions, so that raised a red flag too. Then, detectives questioned Cindy, who was the one who actually found Larry's body, and she was cooperative and helped investigators develop a timeline for the events of the morning, but critically, during her interview, she made it very clear that Anthony was the last person to see Larry alive. Then, investigators learned that the final employee, Richard Shepard, was late for work that morning. And when detectives asked him why, Richard explained that he had stopped at the 24-hour grocery store to buy a drink and some snacks to help him get through his shift. Richard then recounted that when he had gotten to work that morning, he had tried calling Larry to open the door for him, but there was no response, and so he wound up entering through another door, the Babies R Us door, that just happened to be wide open. And then Richard explained that, that in and of itself was very unusual, because they were all under strict orders to keep the doors locked at all times during non-business hours. And so the investigators finished up their initial interviews with the 4 Toys R Us employees who were there that morning, but they told them they would still need to stick around a bit longer. At about noon, the Toys R Us regional manager of loss prevention for the area, Bernie Grusha, came out to the store. Toys R Us corporate had contacted him and sent him out here to try to be as helpful as possible with the investigation. Kashino saw Grusha arrive, walked over and introduced himself, and then a few minutes later asked Grusha to come into the manager's office to try to help the investigators view the store's security footage. Once inside the office, Grusha just plugged the DVR back into the wall and then got the system up and running. Kashino looked at his notes and saw that Cindy said she had arrived at the store shortly before 4 a.m. So Kashino asked Grusha to please wind the security footage back to about 3:45 a.m. And so Grusha pulled up the security video at 3:45 a.m., and then very slowly, the detectives began examining footage from each of the store's more than a dozen security cameras from 3:45 onward. And as they did this, Kashino, who was right nearby, pulled out his notebook and began writing down the exact time at which he saw the employees show up at work on this video, and then he compared the security footage timestamp to the timelines that each of the employees had given him. And also, Kashino took note of where in the store specifically each employee was working during the first 2 hours of their shifts. On the video, Kashino saw Larry, Isaac, and Cindy all entering the store at 3:55 a.m. And then a few minutes later, Larry could be seen in the back of the store, letting that truck driver inside the building so they could offload merchandise. And then, at exactly 4:24 a.m., Kashino noticed some movement from the camera inside of the Babies R Us department that was pointed toward the front door of the building. And so Kashino asked Grusha to please bring that specific video into full frame. And once that video was maximized, the investigators saw a dark figure standing right outside the front door to Babies R Us for about 30 seconds. This figure appeared to struggle with the lock before the door suddenly opened, and they walked inside and disappeared somewhere inside the store. Kashino turned to Grusha and said it sort of looked like the person in the video had jimmied or pried the door open, and Grusha agreed. Kashino directed Grusha to pull up the global view, which would allow them to see all of the cameras at once. This would let them track this mysterious figure's movements through the store. The investigators watched on the global view as this figure disappeared from one camera's view and then popped up in another, but as they watched, it became pretty clear that this person was doing their best to avoid being in front of the cameras. They were snaking and dodging their way through the store, hiding behind shelves wherever they could. I mean, they were acting really sketchy. But more than that, what seemed really apparent to Kashino and Grusha and the other investigators was that this person on the video camera clearly seemed to know the layout of the store and exactly where the hidden cameras inside the building were positioned. At one point, when the intruder walked across one of the camera's field of vision and was relatively easy to see, Kashino asked Grusha to pause the camera and zoom in on this person to get a better look. And as soon as Grusha did this, it was clear to investigators that this person was trying very hard to disguise their identity. The figure had this dark thing wrapped around their face like a scarf. They had all dark clothing on, including dark sweatpants with lettering down the left pant leg, and they were wearing a two-toned baseball cap. But by far the most chilling thing about this figure was what they appeared to be holding in their right hand. It looked very much like they were carrying a large knife. But despite all this, the security video was grainy and low resolution, especially zoomed in, so nobody in the room could make out any of the figure's facial features. The investigators couldn't even make out if this was a man or a woman, and it was also impossible to tell what the lettering on the side of their sweatpants said. And so eventually, Grusha zoomed back out and resumed playing the footage, and everyone in the room watched as this mysterious figure made their way to the front of the store. They moved along the front wall, and then at exactly 4:32 a.m., the figure entered the manager's office. And shortly after that, the security video cut out. And so the running assumption amongst the investigators was that, this intruder must have pulled the plug on the DVR, and that's why it cut. Kashino asked Grusha to rewind the surveillance footage and play it back from the point that figure entered the store. They cycled through the video again, and then once more, slowing it down and zooming in on the intruder again. And eventually, it dawned on one of the investigators that the two-tone baseball cap the figure was seen wearing in the footage looked an awful lot like the Florida Gators hat that had been left behind on the floor inside of the office. And so this confirmed for detectives that that hat they had found had very likely been worn by the killer, and it was, along with this surveillance footage, possibly the most valuable piece of evidence that they had. Once they were finished viewing the surveillance footage, Kashino unplugged the power cord and then carefully bagged it into evidence, because he now knew that the killer had very likely yanked it from the wall. Then Kashino handed off the power cord, along with that hat they had found, to crime scene technicians, who prepared these items to be transported back to the crime lab to be swabbed for DNA. 2 days after Larry's murder, the whole community of Hamburg was still frightened because the killer had not been caught. But by this time, the yellow police tape had been pulled from the perimeter of the Toys R Us, and the store was now open for business and crowded with customers. Police also released the surveillance video and images of the baseball cap to the news media on the off chance that somebody in the area might recognize the killer's walk or maybe the clothing they were wearing. Meanwhile, back at the crime lab, technicians had swabbed the DVR power cord and the Florida Gators baseball cap, and they were able to develop what they believed was the killer's DNA profile. They uploaded that DNA profile into CODIS, which is the federal DNA database with loads and loads of DNA profiles. However, after it was uploaded, there was no match. So at this point, the investigators, which now included the FBI, made it their main objective to collect DNA samples from every employee of the Hamburg Toys R Us store, both current employees and former employees, because many, if not all of these people, would not be in the CODIS database. And remember, the leading theory at this point is that, Larry was killed by potentially an active employee or a former employee, somebody with access to this building and an understanding of where the cameras were. And so over the course of the next few weeks, investigators developed a list of Toys R Us past and present employees and also other people connected to Larry and began making contact with them. Police interviewed literally hundreds of people, and not one person they talked to could think of anyone who would have done this. Seemingly nobody had any issues with Larry Wells. And on top of that, it was like nobody had one unkind thing to say about him. He seemed universally loved. But there was one piece of information that surfaced from a witness who had been near the Toys R Us in the early hours of the morning that Larry was killed. And that person recalled seeing a black Chevy Impala sedan parked inside the toy store's parking lot at that time. Now, this Toys R Us, despite having loads of cameras, did not have any dedicated exterior cameras, so there were no images of this vehicle, and this witness did not get a license plate number for the car. Police also could not immediately trace a black Chevy Impala to any of the Toys R Us employees. And so, while some members of the investigative team searched for this car without much to go on, others continued to track down and collect DNA swabs from current and former employees of the Hamburg Toys R Us, and they ended up with a total of 47 DNA samples. It would take several weeks for each DNA profile to be processed by the crime lab, but finally, in mid-August, a month and a half after Larry's murder, the results from all 47 DNA tests came in. And none were a match, meaning not one of those current or former employees had a DNA profile that matched the DNA profile from the hat and the power cord found inside of the crime scene. Detective Kashino and his team were frankly shocked. They expected there to be a match here, but now they just felt lost. It was like months of work had gotten them nowhere. And so once again, they turned to the FBI for help, and they asked the Bureau to draw up a psychological and personality profile of the killer. And so the FBI created that profile and then began reviewing recent arrests in the upstate New York area, and they would find one person who matched their profile almost exactly. The man's name was Patrick Walden, and he had recently been arrested in a neighboring town, and he had just been released from jail. And Kashino soon learned that the vehicle Patrick was driving when he was arrested was registered to his girlfriend's mother, who happened to be an employee at the Hamburg Toys R Us where Larry Wells was killed. And perhaps even more importantly, Kashino discovered that when police searched that vehicle at the time of Patrick's arrest, inside of the car, they found a very long knife. Detective Kashino and the rest of the investigation now considered Patrick to be their primary suspect. He had a connection to the Toys R Us through his girlfriend's mother, he'd been in possession of a weapon that was at least similar to the one used to kill Larry, and he fit the FBI's profile of the killer. So Kashino quickly secured a warrant to put around-the-clock surveillance on Patrick. And on an afternoon, not long after that, an undercover cop tailed Patrick as he drove through town. The undercover cop made sure to stay far enough back not to draw any attention, and he followed Patrick for several minutes, almost at a leisurely pace. Then the cop noticed Patrick's driver's side window roll down. And so sensing an opportunity here, the cop sped up a bit and leaned forward in his car to get a better look inside of Patrick's car, and he saw Patrick throw something out of the open window onto the street. Now, the cop had no idea what it was, but there was no way he was going to miss this opportunity. And so instead of continuing to trail Patrick, the cop pulled over to the side of the road, he got out, he walked into the middle of the road, being careful of oncoming traffic, and he began looking at the ground for whatever it was Patrick threw, and he couldn't believe his luck. Because right there in the middle of the road was a still smoldering cigarette butt, something Patrick had just been smoking. And so it would definitely have a sample of Patrick's DNA on it. And so the undercover cop slipped on a pair of gloves, he crouched down, picked up the butt, carefully extinguished it, dropped it into an evidence bag, and headed back to his vehicle. The cigarette butt was sent to the crime lab for processing, and Detective Cascino and his team thought that was going to be a huge break in the case. But as with all the other DNA samples police had collected to that point, Cascino knew it would still take weeks before test results came back. And during that time, the local news started running stories about how the investigation still hadn't caught the killer, and about how people in the community were tense, feeling as though anyone among them could be the killer. And on top of that, Larry's widow was now more than 5 months pregnant with the couple's second daughter, who would be born without a father. And Larry's widow and the rest of Larry's family feared that the investigation was really losing momentum. And so Cascino was feeling a ton of pressure to crack this case. So while he and his team waited for DNA results on the cigarette butt, they went back to the beginning, reviewing their case files and looking for anything they might have overlooked. And it was at that point that investigators realized there was still one Toys R Us employee on their list that they actually had not obtained a DNA sample from. In fact, every time they had contacted this particular employee to request a sample, this person had an excuse as to why it wasn't a good time. They were either out of town, attending a family event, or just feeling under the weather. And the more time that passed, the more it seemed like this employee was actually deliberately trying to avoid giving their DNA sample. So detectives reached out to this person again and said, hey, we got to do this sample. But once again, the employee said, no, it was not a good time. They said they were still very distraught over everything that had happened. And so for the time being, they had gone to stay at their father's house, so they were not around to give the sample. Cascino and his team believed that they had already been patient enough with this employee, and that the employee's evasiveness was really starting to look quite suspicious. So the investigators located this employee's father's house, and they drove out there hoping to basically force this employee to give a DNA sample. And so the investigators made their way out to this house, they parked outside, got out of their vehicles, and began walking up towards the door. And as they passed by a car that was parked in the driveway, one of the investigators stopped in his tracks. He called out to the others and waved them over to the car he was next to, and then he pointed to something on the rear bumper. It was a Florida Gators bumper sticker. And remember, there was a Florida Gators hat found in the crime scene. That's where the DNA sample was being pulled from. When Cascino saw this, he felt a jolt of excitement. He felt like this could be a big break. And so he and the others walked up to the front door and they knocked, and the employee they were trying to get this DNA sample from answered, appearing very surprised to see the investigators at their father's house. But Cascino was very disarming, and he apologized for bothering them. And he said, look, I know this is not a good time, but the police department really needs to get their DNA right now, just so they can eliminate them from the suspect pool. The employee nodded and said they understood, and then Cascino handed them a swab and asked them to please put it in their mouth and swab their cheek. The employee did that and handed the swab right back, and Cascino dropped it into a plastic vial and sealed it inside. The investigators thanked the employee, then they returned to their vehicles and drove back to the station. Once there, they handed over the swab to the crime lab, but they knew, just like with the Patrick Walden swab and all the others, they would have to wait weeks before this result would come back. While they waited, no major new leads developed. The only thing that came up was investigators learned that Isaac, the employee whose anxiousness had raised suspicions right after the murder, quit his job at Toys R Us, but that didn't really lead the police anywhere. Then finally, in the middle of October, DNA test results came back for Patrick Walden, who had thrown that cigarette butt out the window that the undercover had found, and also for the final Toys R Us employee that police had to go to his father's house to collect that swab for. And one of those two DNA profiles would be a match for the DNA that was found on the Florida Gators hat and the security DVR power cord. And so, more than 3 months after Larry Wells was murdered, Detective Cascino and his team now knew what happened inside the Toys R Us on that Saturday morning in June. And they knew the identity of that figure in the grainy surveillance footage. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened at the Toys R Us on June 29, 2013. In the dark, early morning hours, the killer drove a black Chevy Impala into the Toys R Us parking lot. They parked the vehicle and then just sat there, scoping out the closed store and planning their entry. After a few minutes, the killer pulled a scarf around their face to conceal their identity. They grabbed their knife off the passenger seat and then got out of their car and walked up to the Babies R Us entrance on the side of the store. The killer walked up to the entrance and then kind of jostled at the door for about 30 seconds until they got it open, and then they went inside. Once inside, they very carefully walked along the walls, ducking behind shelves and doing their best to hide from the store surveillance cameras. The killer eventually reached the manager's office, and they walked inside and closed the door behind them. The killer then walked over to the DVR surveillance system and pulled the power cord out of the wall, disabling all the cameras in the store. 15 minutes later, store manager Larry Wells entered that very same office and right away saw the killer crouched over, attempting to open up the store safe. The killer heard Larry enter and they wheeled around and immediately held up their knife and demanded Larry come over here and open the safe. But Larry, instead of doing that, just reached for the phone to call for help. But at the same time, the killer lunged at Larry and the two men began to struggle. Larry tried desperately to push the killer off of him, but the killer began swinging their arms wildly, at one point stabbing Larry in the shoulder. And when that happened, Larry stumbled forward, and the killer at that point just raised the knife again and brought it down into Larry, stabbing him in the left side of his chest. Larry screamed out in pain and then collapsed into the chair. The killer just stood there for a second, shocked at the sight of Larry now bleeding profusely from the stab wound they had just inflicted on him. And so the killer, who was starting to panic, just forgot about the safe and just turned and ran out of the office, not realizing their baseball cap had fallen off during the attack. Once out of the office, the killer slipped through the store unseen and rushed back outside. They got back into their Impala, sped out of the parking lot, and tossed the knife into a dumpster as they fled the scene. Back in the manager's office, Larry Wells was slipping in and out of consciousness. But in one of his conscious moments, he did manage to trip the store alarm. However, despite that alarm going off, Larry would lay there bleeding for nearly an hour before he was finally discovered and help was called. But unfortunately, by that point, it was already too late. For months, detectives had dealt with one DNA test after another that did not match the hat or the DVR cord. But they did finally get a match from that last employee they had tested. And that employee was Bernie Grusha, the regional vice president of loss prevention for Toys R Us, and the same man who had assisted investigators with the security footage. He literally watched himself maneuver through the store, eventually committing a murder while he sat there with police. On October 16, 2013, police arrested Grusha and charged him with the murder of his friend and employee, Larry Wells. Investigators served a search warrant on Grusha's home, and what they found in the garage of the house brought them much closer to understanding his motives. Police found over $200,000 in stolen Toys R Us merchandise. And what the investigation would soon uncover is that Bernie Grusha, who had been hired to protect Toys R Us assets, was actually robbing Toys R Us blind. He had stolen merchandise from numerous Toys R Us stores in New York and Pennsylvania, and he was then reselling this merchandise on eBay to help chip away at his mountain of debt while continuing to live a lifestyle that was way beyond his means. Investigators learned that his wife became fed up with Grusha's reckless spending, and she also discovered that he was cheating on her, and so their marriage was falling apart. And just 3 weeks before Larry Wells' murder, Grusha had had this argument with his wife, after which he had left the room, ran upstairs, entered the master bedroom, got out his 9mm Beretta pistol, and fired it. And his wife ran upstairs and found her husband lying face down on the floor, thinking he must have killed himself, And so she frantically ran to him and turned him over, at which point he looked back at her, completely unharmed, and told her he just wanted to test her and see how she'd react. His wife reacted by calling the police, who quickly showed up, confiscated the gun, and placed Grusha under arrest on charges of criminal possession of a weapon and harassment. His wife then filed a protection order, and so Grusha could not return to the house that he shared with his family. So he went to live with his father as his life continued to fall apart. Grusha had reached a point of total desperation by the time he parked the black Chevy Impala in the Toys R Us parking lot that morning in late June, before taking the life of a man he had hired and considered his friend. It turned out Grusha had rented that black Chevy Impala, and when he arrived back at the store later to assist investigators, he was driving his own car. But police were able to trace that rental car back to him, which further solidified their case. Investigators also discovered that Grusha had actually used his key to unlock the Babies R Us door. He had simply pretended to be prying it open for the security cameras, because he figured that would point investigators to a lower-ranking employee or someone who did not work at the store at all. Grusha eventually admitted to everything he had done in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed he did not intend to kill Larry Wells that morning, that he had gone in there to commit a robbery, and then things had simply got out of control, and he had stabbed Larry while flailing about with his knife in his hand. Prosecutors knew there was no way they could prove intent, so they ended up reducing the murder charge to just first-degree manslaughter. And so Bernie Grusha pled guilty and was sentenced to a minimum term of 25 years in prison. Before sunrise on August 22, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed. He swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground. He stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nios, and Nios is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nios and Lower Nios. Ephraim lived in Upper Nios, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nios, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nios, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nios, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nios, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nios Nios to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nios. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nios, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him. The combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nios. The villagers in Lower Nios lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nios was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nios, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nios, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nios, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars, and many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him. But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare. And they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Naquain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door, and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out, and so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently, and then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there, there were people, and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, but Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent, and then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously, and so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nios to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nios, and when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nios that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nios had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock, and then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nios." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nios 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nios, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people. And after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened. And they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again. And in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up. It sounded preposterous. But now, in Nios, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nios, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nios is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nios. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous. Your skin will start to feel like it's on fire. You'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nyos had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes. And when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nyos and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nyos and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown, unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nyos, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown, unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again. In April of 1979, a 69-year-old woman named Monica Myers was appointed mayor of a little village called Betterton in the U.S. state of Maryland. Betterton used to be this very fancy resort town on the water where people from Baltimore and Philadelphia would come there for vacations. They had fancy hotels and restaurants and shops. But by the time Monica became Betterton's mayor, Betterton had kind of gone downhill. People had stopped coming to Betterton. All the hotels shut down or were abandoned or burned down. The summer homes of the rich people from the big cities, those got sold off. And down at the beach, all these glamorous boardwalks literally just kind of crumbled into the sea. And in their place were all these shanty towns where homeless people set up their camps. But Monica had grown up in Betterton, and so she really loved the town and wanted to improve it. And so when she became mayor in 1979, she really leaned into her new role way more than other mayors would. Instead of managing the village from an office, like most mayors would do, Monica literally went out in town and just began doing lots of jobs around the town for free. She would ride around with the police and literally stop crimes in action. One time, she stumbled across someone looting a vacant hotel, and she personally got out, chased this person down, and made them put everything back that they had taken. She would pick up trash on the beach. She would do random repairs on people's homes and businesses all over town. And sometimes she would just go door to door asking people how they were doing. And so very quickly, the people of Betterton really grew to love Monica, and they loved seeing her every single day just out and about making Betterton a better place. And so on March 20th, 1980, roughly 1 year into Monica's tenure as mayor, it was immediately noticeable to the people of Betterton when Monica was nowhere to be seen. That day, she did not go to the police station in the morning like she normally did. She was not seen at the beach doing her trash pickup, and she didn't knock on anybody's door. And so by mid-morning that day, the people of Betterton, all 120 of them, were basically out in force looking for Monica. And at 11:30 a.m., the police in Betterton got a call about Monica. It was this guy who was totally panicked. He could barely make a sentence, and he basically just told the police, "You gotta get here now." And so the police hopped in their cars and they sped to the address this guy gave them. And when they got there, they saw it was this very plain, boxy building that was kind of tucked back in the woods. It was far away from the town center, and really nobody ever went over here. And the police, when they parked their cars, they saw the guy who had called the police, the distraught caller, was standing outside of the front door. He was obviously crying, and he was waving for them to come over and follow him into this building. And so the police got out of their cars, they ran over to this guy, and they're asking him, what happened? Where's Monica? What's going on? But this guy was so hysterical, he really could not describe what happened to Monica. He just kept telling them to come on, follow me. And so he led them into this building, and pretty quickly they entered this huge warehouse where all across the ceiling were these big metal catwalk areas that kind of zigged and zagged all over this warehouse, and below them, all over the floor, were these huge industrial-sized 15-foot tall vats that contained something. And so this guy who had led police here, he stops and he just points at the nearest vat. And so the police, picking up his cue, begin walking towards this vat. And as they got closer and closer, they were hit with this horrible smell that made them gag and cough. And before long, they had to stop and kind of compose themselves. The smell was so bad. It would turn out this building that was kind of removed from the town center of Betterton was Betterton's sewage treatment plant. And that morning, Monica had gone to the treatment plant to help clean some of these 15-foot tall industrial-sized vats that contained human waste. She had done this enough times that when she was here, she did not need any supervision. And so that morning, she was alone. She climbed up onto one of the catwalks over one of these big vats, and she had reached down with her testing kit to test the sewage to see how much cleaning it would need. And as she did that, she somehow slipped and fell into the big vat of human waste. Now, she would not have immediately gone under. It was not like a liquid. It was more like clay or really thick mud, where at first she would have kind of been laying on top of the sewage. But as soon as she tried to move to get out of the sewage would have functioned more like quicksand, where as soon as a part of her body went under the surface, it would not come up again. And so after the police composed themselves, they climbed up onto the catwalk and they looked down and they saw Monica, who was face down, partially submerged inside of this vat, and she was deceased. Her autopsy would reveal that she died of drowning, which means she literally inhaled human waste.